And joining me now is one of those potential vice presidential picks, Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio. Senator Rubio, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, let's dive into the state of the race. The last time you were asked about whether you had spoken with former President Trump about being his running mate, you said you hadn't. So can you update us? Have you spoken to the former president about potentially being his running mate?
I haven't spoken to the president. I haven't spoken to anybody in the campaign. The only people that have spoken to me about vice president, for the most part, are members of the media, and which is fine. Look, this is part of the deal. The primaries are over, and so, political reporters have to cover politics. And I understand the VP stuff is an interesting horse race question, but there's only one person on this planet that knows who the vice presidential pick is going to be, and his name is Donald Trump, and he's got time to make that decision and a lot of really good people to pick from. But I've never spoken to anybody on the campaign about it.
Let me ask it this way. We have noticed that you have not been on the campaign trail with the former president in recent days. We haven't seen you show up in court. Do you want the job of vice president, Senator?
Well, first of all, I'll do whatever the campaign asks me to do. So I've been at events to help raise money and so forth. We're also in session in Washington, so we've got some work there. We had open hearings this week in the Intelligence Committee, and so that's going on. But I'll be there to be helpful because I want him to win. If Joe Biden, and it's the part of the second answer, is I want to serve the country. As I'm not presumptuous to tell you I'm going to be offered anything. As I said, he's got a lot of good people to pick from. Here's what I do know. If Joe Biden is reelected president, the damage to this country, I believe, in some cases will be generational, and if some of it will be irreversible. That's how high the stakes are. I cannot imagine another 4 years under Joe Biden as president, and I will do virtually anything to ensure that Donald Trump wins and that Joe Biden does not, because we can't afford as a nation to have another 4 years like the last 3.5.
So just to put a fine point on it, you would say yes if you were asked to serve as his vice presidential nominee?
Again, that would be presumptuous for me. I think anyone who's offered that job to serve this country in the second highest office, assuming everything else in your life makes sense at that moment, if you're interested in serving the country, it's an incredible place to serve. But I just think this kind of speculation, we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. As I said, we'll find out soon enough, but I've never spoken to anybody about it. So why would I even opine on something that I've never spoken to the campaign about?
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's talk about one of the major policy issues of this campaign, the issue of abortion. Senator, would you support a federal abortion ban?
Well, I'm pro-life, and to me, this is not even a political issue. I understand it is for a lot of people, and I understand this is a divisive issue in our country, and not everybody shares my views on it. But I believe that human life is worthy of dignity and protection, and I support laws that protect our unborn human life. I always have, as I've done in the past. When people talk about a federal abortion ban, what they're talking about is the 15-week ban, which Lindsey Graham sponsored and I have co-sponsored in the past. That law is less restrictive or identical to virtually every country in Europe except for 2. Now, the extremists here are the Democrats. Not once, but twice, they have voted in Congress to support a law that basically has no meaningful restrictions. They claim it does, but it has no meaningful restrictions. And I think if we are indeed in this republic, which is what we live in a divisive issue like this, where everybody's views have to be taken into account, it's very difficult to find, if there is such a thing, an arrangement at the federal level with people who basically will not vote for any meaningful restrictions on abortion.
Well, of course, the restrictions would be after 21 weeks. But let me ask it to you this way. Donald Trump
No, that's
says,
not accurate. I'm sorry, that's not what that bill did. No, I'm sorry, but that's not what that bill did. That bill, it didn't say anything about doctors. It said practitioners. So it didn't have to be a doctor that makes this decision. It doesn't say anything about a reasonable harm. It's just a good faith. And so basically, even if it's remote and unlikely, you could still say, and it's not even about, by the way, in the law that they had, it's not even about the life of the mother, it's about the health. So it could be a nurse practitioner or a nurse, or healthcare practitioner, someone needs to define that, and it can be for virtually any reason. So I understand what they claim the bill did, but in practice, that bill had no meaningful restrictions. It was, in essence, a vote, not once, but twice, from Democrats to have abortion at any time for any reason.
Let me just note, though, that less than 1% of abortions take place after 21 weeks. Let me just ask you, though, this
Then everybody should be in favor of just ban. If they're so rare, then let's just ban them all after 21 weeks. Why are they fighting so hard on that?
Well, because usually if they happen, it's because there is a crisis with the health of the mother. Let me ask you, though, Donald Trump says
no, but if there's a crisis with the life of the mother, a real crisis, that every bill has that restriction in place. Every bill has that exception.
Senator, let me ask it this way. Donald Trump says, quote, he's not signing a national abortion ban. Do you disagree with him on that point?
Well, he won't get to sign one because there's no way we can pass it. I've never claimed we have 60 votes in the Senate and votes in the House and everything else that goes in between. I don't believe any time in it, but I don't support those bills because I think they're actually about to pass. And I think what Trump has actually said is that what he wants to do is negotiate with the Democrats. I think he said it on this program, that he wants to negotiate with the Democrats on this, which I think, in a country where you're trying to save unborn human life, and I support laws that do so, even if they don't have everything I want them to have in there, that's his goal. And so, but that's a statement of fact. He will never get a chance to sign that law because right now we don't have the votes to pass it. That doesn't mean that's not what I believe. It's just kind of the reality of the politics.
Well, but he's not talking about whether the votes are there. He has said point blank he's not signing a national abortion ban. Let me ask you, though.
Because he wants to negotiate with the Democrats on the issues, he said.
He also said on this program that a 6-week abortion ban that was signed into law in Florida, in your state, is a, quote, terrible thing, a terrible mistake. Is he wrong on that point, Senator?
Well, again, I'm pro-life, so I support laws that save unborn human life. Other people have different opinions on what our law should be. That law that you're referring to was passed by elected legislators in the state of Florida. House members that have to go back to their voters every 2 years. It wasn't senators that have to go back every 4 years. And that's the way our republic works. So it's a representative democracy, and people have to go back to their voters and justify. I am of the belief that unborn human, I don't want to impose anything on anyone. I get that this is two competing rights here that are crashing into each other, but I err on the side of supporting unborn human life because of the dignity of all human life. That's my view. I want our laws to represent it. Other people have different views, but in our representative democracy, people who have to answer to voters in the state of Florida voted for that, and voters will now get to take that into account in this election and any future election.
Just to put a fine point on it, you are disagreeing with Donald Trump on his opposition to that 6-week ban. You support the 6-week ban?
But I think even within the pro-life movement, there's all kinds of disagreement about what the laws should be.
But you
Some of it is practical on what we can pass.
You support the 6-week ban?
I support any life. I support any bill that protects unborn human life. But I don't consider other people in the pro-life movement who have a different view to be apostate. They just have a different view about the best ways to approach this issue. We are not like the Democrats, where unless you are in favor of their bills that basically say, let's just put in all this fancy language, but it's not meaningful in terms of any restrictions, you won't get Planned Parenthood, for example, who supports all these Democrats, to get their support and NARAL support. You have to be for abortion at any time. I don't care what they say. That's the practical impact of their laws. They are radicals on this.
All right, Senator, let's move on to immigration. If reelected, Donald Trump has said he's willing to build migrant detention camps and deploy the U.S. military to deport the more than 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. It would be the largest deportation operation in American history. Do you support that plan?
11 million. That's an outdated. That was the number 10 years ago. We're talking upwards of 20, 25, maybe 30 million.
Well,
There's been almost 10 million people that have entered this country unlawfully in the last 3 years.
To the question, would you support it?
The number varies big time. I mean, it's another 9 to 10 million people just in the last 3 years. The answer to your question is yes. We cannot absorb 25, 30 million people who entered this country illegally. They're here illegally. What country on earth would tolerate that? We don't even know who most of these people are. They talk about vetting them with what? They're coming from nations that don't even have document systems in many cases. Yes, we are going to have to do something, unfortunately. We're going to have to do something dramatic to remove people from this country that are here illegally, especially people we know nothing about. But 10 million, 11 million, that was the number 15 years ago. Today, it's upwards of probably 25 to 30 million, maybe more.
Senator, here's what you said about Donald Trump's mass deportations proposals in 2016. Take a look.
I don't think it's reasonable to say you're going to round up and deport 11 million people. I don't think it's a plan that works. I don't think that's a realistic policy.
So why have you changed your mind now?
Because the issue has completely changed. When I said that, and back in 2013, when I was involved in immigration reform, we had 11, 12 million people that had been here for longer than a decade. Now we've had almost that number in the last 3 years alone from all over the world, including people that I believe are terrorists, people that I believe are going to conduct terrorist attacks in this country if given the opportunity, certainly people that were criminals in their home country. This is a completely different, this is not immigration. You asked me about immigration. This is mass migration. Mass migration. This is an invasion of the country. And it needs to be dealt with dramatically. And by the way, I'm a big poll follower, but polls show most Americans agree with us on this.
And of course, that was an issue under former President Trump as well. There was just a bipartisan proposal that was put on the table that would put more funding into border enforcement as well as limiting asylum. Republicans walked away from that. But let me move on to my next question.
No, we can't move on because that's not what that bill did. That bill also created asylum officers who right on the border will be able to give people asylum, and you give someone asylum right on the border without any appeal, no judge, nothing, just an asylum officer, they are on a path to citizenship. That's why I oppose that bill.
Your fellow Republican said it was the best deal that they had seen in a long, long time. But Senator,
which fellow Republican?
Senator Lindsey Graham.
Which fellow Republican said that?
Senator Lindsey Graham. Just to name
well,
one.
Then I disagree with Lindsey. That's what he said. I'm not in favor of asylum officers at the border that can issue asylum rulings right at the border.
And Senator James Langford, of course, negotiated. But let me look forward. Will you accept the election results of 2024, no matter what happens, Senator?
No matter what happens? No, if it's an unfair election, I think it's going to be contested by either side.
Senator, no matter who wins.
I think you're asking the wrong person. The Democrats are the ones that have opposed every Republican victory since 2000. Every single one. It's Hillary Clinton.
No Democrat has refused to concede. Hillary Clinton conceded. Senator, will you accept the election results?
Hillary Clinton said the election was stolen from her and that Trump was illegitimate. Kamala Harris agreed.
Senator,
we have Democrats now.
Senator, she conceded the election. She said that Trump was illegitimate. She said that the election had been stolen. Kamala Harris agreed. By the way, there are Democrats serving in Congress today who in 2004 voted not to certify the Ohio electors because they said those machines had been tampered with. And you have Democrats now saying they won't certify 2024 because Trump is an insurrectionist and ineligible to hold office. So you need to ask them. I think you've had have you ever asked a Democrat this question on your show? I bet you've never asked a Democrat that question. Senator, you voted to certify the 2020 election, and here is what you said on that day that you voted to certify the 2020 election.
Democracy is held together by people's confidence in the election and their willingness to abide by its results.
So by your own definition, are Donald Trump's claims undermining Americans' confidence in democracy, given that he has not conceded the last election, and he just said in recent days twice that he won Minnesota, Senator?
I think what undermines people's confidence in the election is when you have places like Wisconsin with over 500 illegal drop box locations, when you have places like Georgia where liberal groups are paying people $10 per vote. No, but listen, what undermines elections is when NBC News and every major news outlet in America in 2020 censored the Biden laptop story, which turned out to be true, not Russian misinformation, unprecedented. Only you couldn't even talk about it on social media. They would deplatform you. People look at all this. They look at what happened in Arizona, 200,000 ballots that had the signatures didn't match. People will lose confidence, and it opens the door to this.
I have to jump in here. Senator, you voted to certify the election, and
because at that stage in the process, you have no options.
Senator, you voted to certify the election. Nothing has been censored on this program. Hillary Clinton
did you guys cover the laptop for Joe Biden in 2020?
Absolutely, we covered the laptop.
It was banned. You couldn't even talk about it in social media.
Chris Krebs, the top
election official, you couldn't talk about it in social media. It'd be deplatformed. You couldn't even talk about it because they said it was Russian disinformation.
Senator Rubio,
voters in many cases didn't even hear about it because it was blacked out by the media.
We did cover the election, and just to note that Chris Krebs, who was a top Trump election official, called it the safest and most secure election in recent history. Senator Rubio, we are out of time.
Of course we are, but I'm telling you that if it's unfair, we are going to do the same thing Democrats do. We're going to use lawyers to go to court and point out the fact that states are not following their own election laws.
But the Democrats,
hopefully we'll have a fair election and it'll be unquestioned.
Senator, all those cases were brought to court cases and lost, and there was no proof that there was any widespread fraud, as you know. But I appreciate.
I never used the word widespread fraud.
I'm sorry. All right, Senator Rubio, thank you very much. I appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.